Hello, Ash, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Harrison Bergeron today. It's a short story by Kurt Vonnegut. It's a dystopian story. It offers like a cautionary tale um, about the dangers of excessive equality and the horrors of totalitarianism. Um, it talks it talks about the idea of absolute equality and the potential consequences it could have on society. It was written in 1961, so something to think about. Like around the time that it was written, um, things were going on. It was like right after the Vietnam War, around the time the Berlin Wall was built that divided East and West Germany. It was right after the Bay of Pigs, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the landmark case of the Brown versus Board of Education, which declared racial segregation. Um, it still relates to today with the themes and issues like censorship, kind of like the stuff that we have going on with TikTok right now, political correctness, civil rights. It highlights the dangers of government oppression and the importance of individuality and freedom. So let's get into it. Let me see here. All right, Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else, nobody was better looking than anybody else, nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All of this equality was due to the 211th, 12th, and 13th Amendments to the Constitution and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy um, by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son Harrison away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned into a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, a transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas, um, like right here. These were the ballerinas. I've lost my place. Oh, they were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm. That was a real pretty dance they just did, said Hazel. Huh? Said George. That dance, it was nice, said Hazel. Yup. He tried to think a little bit about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good. No better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked uh, so that no one seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face would feel like something a cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did two of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball peen hammer, said George. I think it would be really interesting hearing all different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All things they think up. Um, said George. Only if I were the handicapper general. You know what I would do, said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chains on Sunday. I'd have chimes on Sunday, just chimes, to kind of honor of, in kind of an honor of religion. I could think, I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else, said George. Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison, about 24 gun salute in his head, uh, but a 21 gun salute in his head stopped that. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling in tears, and stood on the rims of his eyes. Two of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed onto the floor. They were holding their temples. All of a sudden, you look very tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so's you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not as equal for me for a while. George weighed the bag in his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just part of me. You've been so tired and worn out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take a few of them lead balls out, just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take out a few when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people would try to get away with it, and pretty soon we'd be right back to the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing against everybody. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think will happen to society? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to his question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. Reckon I'd fall apart, said Hazel. Or reckon it'd all fall apart. What would, said George blankly. Society, said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, in the state of heightened excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." He finally gave up and handed the bulletin to the ballerina to read. "That's all right," Hazel said of the announcer. "He tried. That's the big thing. He tried the best he could with what God gave him. Um, he should get a nice raise for trying so hard." "Ladies and gentlemen," said the ballerina, reading the bulletin, "she must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all of the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she said, and she had to apologize for at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was warm, luminous, timeless melody. "Excuse me," she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. "Harrison Bergeron, age 14," she said with a grackle squawk, "has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete and is under-handicapped and should be regarded as extremely dangerous." A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, and then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against the background, calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween and hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the handicapper general men could think him up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of headphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but give him wanging headaches besides. Scrap metal was hung over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the handicapper general men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. "If you see this boy," said the ballerina, "do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him." There was a shriek in the door of the door being torn off the hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set through the photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen, jumped again and again as though dancing to a unique earthquake. Harrison Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well might have for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crushing tune. My God, said George, that must be Harrison. The realization blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hands. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, announcers, all cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. I am the Emperor! Cried Harrison. Sorry, that was so loud. Do you hear? I am the Emperor. Everybody must do as I say at once. He stomped his foot and the studio shook. Even as I stand here, he bellowed, crippled, hobbled, sickened. I am a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now watch me as I become what I can become. Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock that secured his harness. The bar snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber nose, revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. I shall now select my empress, he said, looking down on the cowering people. Let the first woman who dares to raise to her feet claim her mate and her throne. A moment passed, and the ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, swapped off her physical handicaps, and with marvelous delicacy, last of all, removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. Now, said Harrison, taking her hand, shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance? Music, he commanded. Musician. I'm getting a cold. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them from their handicaps too. Play your best, he told them. I'll make you barons and dukes and earls. The music began and was normal at first, cheap, silly, false, but Harrison snatched two of the musicians from their chair and waved them like batons as he sang the music and waited and that he waved them like batons as he sang the music as he wanted it played. Sorry. He slammed them back down into their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Oh, excuse me. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listening gravely as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weights to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then an explosion of joy and grace sprang into the air. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity, the laws of and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, and swiveled, that word, capered, gambooled, am I having a stroke? They spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intuition to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in the air, inches below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled shotgun. She fired twice, and the emperor and the empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them that they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. But it was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out. Hazel turned to the comment about the blackout, and Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with a beer, paused while the handicap signal shook him up, and then sat back down again. "You've been crying," he said to Hazel. "Yup," she said. "What about?" "Ah, forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "Always do." "That's my girl," said George. He winced as there was a sound of riveting gunshots in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You can say that again." "Gee," said Hazel, "I could tell that one was a doozy." I don't know. I really like that. I really like the story. I think it's interesting. Let me know what you think about it. How do you think it relates to today and stuff? With everything that's going on, like, what do you think was going on in his mind versus what's going on in the minds of people today? Let me know.